that an abstraction is a possibility. It's a possible form of definiteness. And the implication of that is that when we think, we are entertaining possibilities. This is really interesting, right? What is a thought? A thought is a possibility. And because we are the type of beings who, by our decisions, make things actual. We'll talk more about this, right? But we are the type of being who, by our decisions, make things actual. And so when we think and we entertain possibilities, our thinking is relevant to reality. It conditions reality. Our thinking is causally implicated in the ongoing flow of actual events. Thinking is not something separate from reality. It's an element in making things real. It's part of what makes things real. All right, so let's go over that once more because it's so important. I'm saying that in order for us to make sense of reality, in this way of making sense of reality that I am presenting, we begin by distinguishing the concrete from the abstract. The abstract are characters of events. So I look at the cup and I can say, what color is it? And then I say, I abstract whiteness and blue-greenness. I abstract them because of my interest. I can look at the top and say, what shape is it? And then I can abstract roundness, right? So the abstractions are specific characters that events have that we can bring into our attention by the operation of abstraction, which is responsive to our interests. Right? And the entities that we abstract are possibilities of definiteness, possibilities that have been realized and possibilities that may be realized in the future. Right? So we have abstractions, characteristics, forms, ideas, red, blue, green, conscious, value, any quality you can name, right, is an abstraction. And then we have actual events which are characterized by those characteristics. Possibility and actuality. Possibility per se is not in time or space in the same way that events are. Events are specifically located in time and space, and they're unique. Events pertain to possibility. They can recur, and they can be in more than one place at a time. And this is the fundamental ontological distinction that we're beginning with. Concrete and abstract, actual and possible. Now, there are a couple other things about this I want to say. First of all, events can be more or less complex. So for example, the event of this cup is not as complex as the event of me. Right? Events vary in complexity. The characters of events vary in their level of complexity, in the number of elements they have, and the intricacy of their interrelations. And so there are different kinds of events depending on how complex they are. And again, I want to emphasize that abstractions are always beheld by actualities. You are an actuality. I am an actuality. That, by the way, is one of the fundamental premises of this whole approach. I want to say that each one of you is as actual as anything ever was actual. You are real. I am real. We are real. In every moment, we're actual. And so we ourselves are examples of actual entities. In every moment, we are actual, and we can learn from that. And abstracting is an activity that is done by beings like us. only actual beings abstract characteristics from reality and project characteristics into the possible future. And for each one of us as an actual being, the particular abstractions to which we attend are affected by our interests, so that no particular set of abstractions is ever absolute or comprehensive. And then abstractions can be more or less adequate to the objects that they represent. Right? So, for example, I know each one of you personally, and so when I look at you, the impression I get of you, the way I represent you to me, or as Whitehead would say, the way you objectify in me, the way you become an object for me, is very rich and full. Right? The whole history is there, my whole sense of your presence, your interest, your sharing with me, it's all there. But on the other hand, I could look at you all just as students, in which case it would be very abstract. It wouldn't be a very adequate representation of you if I just gave you all one category, right? Or if I were an economist, I could look at you all as consumers. Or if I was really an enlightened economist, I could look at you as producers. But you see, it's very abstract. It's not really adequate to who you are. You see what I'm getting at here, right? And so the abstractions that we pull from the events in our life can be adequate or inadequate. Also, the descriptions that we use to describe the real world can be adequate or inadequate. Right? So what I want to say here is that once we recognize that abstractions are experiences, and that as experiences they're conditioned by interest, we know that they are not absolute. Right? No abstraction ever encompasses or represents the whole reality of the event which it represents. So no philosophical system, no truth that we can articulate here will be an absolute truth. But on the other hand, the abstractions that we use can be more or less adequate to what we want them to do. And I'm going to suggest that the scientistic or the reductionistic scientific abstractions that we've been using to explain reality are not adequate, and that the set of abstractions that I'm going to shadow out here in these lectures is more adequate, without claiming that it's in any way ultimate. Okay. Now, with all this in mind, now let's go back and look at what we were taught at elementary school about the nature of the world, what we were taught in our science classes about the nature of the world. I want to suggest that there are two problems that infect the modern common understanding of reality. And the first is that the abstractions of science are too abstract a representation of reality, and that they're too simple, that they don't go deep enough to really represent what's important. So, for example, Newtonian mechanics, which says that the universe consists of a Cartesian grid with little infinitely small gravitational BBs in it, is brilliantly suited to analyzing the motions of inorganic entities in space and time. It works. It's great for that, right? So if you're approaching reality and you're only interested in falling bodies, Newtonian mechanics is the thing for you. Right? But to assume that you can represent all of reality in terms of a set of abstractions that is only responsive to an interest in falling bodies is not good philosophy. It's not good sociology. It's not good common sense. It's not healthy. Right? It's a great abstraction for that purpose, but it's not a good abstraction for describing the reality of our experience. And most of scientific reductionism falls into the error of trying to explain the richness of our actuality in terms of a set of abstractions which is not adequate because it responds to interests that are too narrow. That's the first thing. But the second thing is much more pernicious. And this second thing is what Whitehead calls the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. Right? The fallacy of misplaced concreteness. And the idea of the fallacy of misplaced concreteness is that human beings have a tendency to confuse their abstractions from reality for the real thing. Right? We think that our ideas are the real thing, whereas our experience is not. Right? So, for example, if we go back to Newton, Newton comes up with this brilliant set of abstractions in terms of which motion can be mathematically analyzed. Huge accomplishment. And there's this picture. And the fantasy is, the picture is that if we regard all the entities around us and we abstract from their consciousness, and we abstract from their purposeful behavior, and we abstract from their livingness, and we abstract from much of their complexity, we can imagine them in terms of little BBs of mass. Right? And if we ignore almost everything we experience about space, the incredible mandala-like appearance, the miraculous texture of space, if we ignore that, we can describe space in terms of a three-dimensional Cartesian grid. Okay, fine, right? So now we've got this picture of a three-dimensional grid with BBs in it. Now the next step, the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, happens when we say that Newton's set of abstractions are the real world. That this that we're seeing is just some sort of confused appearance. But out there on the other side of appearance, the real world consists of these three-dimensional space and these BBs, which are not even in time and space the way we are. They're not even actual the way we are. Right? And then once we do that, once we say reality is out there, then all of this becomes problematical. How do we explain consciousness? How do we know anything? It's impossible, because we've taken reality and put it out there and made this unreal. Right? That's what happens when we fall into the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. Right? The Buddha talked about ignorance as being one of the fundamental causes of suffering. And many of the Buddhist schools interpret ignorance to be the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. There's an idea that we have of the ego. Eric, I have this idea of a certain identity that I am, and I confuse myself with the idea. And then I act as if the idea is right, and I hate myself when I don't correspond to the idea. Right? So that's another way of having a bifurcation in reality. We don't want to do that. Right? We have to recognize abstractions for what they are. They're abstractions. Abstractions are not actualities. They're just abstractions. We can't say that what's real is abstract and what's actual is somehow secondary or non-existent. This is what's real. This is actual. You are actual. Every moment of experience is actual. And atoms and three-dimensional space and collapse to the quantum wave function, those are abstractions. Abstractions are not what's real. When we begin to have the capacity to differentiate abstractions from the concrete, we can also realize that all explanation is an activity of accounting for the concrete in terms of a set of abstractions. Right, so in Newtonian mechanics, I'm accounting for all of reality in terms of BBs in three-dimensional space. Right? And once we realize that the abstractions aren't the real thing, we can begin listening to the people around us differently. And we'll find that most of our most bewildering conversations happen when people are using different sets of abstractions to account for reality. And so when we begin to see that, it becomes much more possible for us to reconcile our thoughts and have intelligent conversations.